Several years ago, I began my first circuit bending project, a Casio PT-87. I added a simple clock modification to adjust pitch. I also attempted several other unsuccessful modifications, which have since been removed, though I plan to revisit them in the future. Looking online at other circuit-bent Casio PT-87s, I noticed something that mine lacked. All these other keyboards were cosmetically in fantastic condition, whereas mine was full of holes from previous experimentation. So I decided to build an entire new case for my keyboard, out of wood.
So I've got these three pieces so far. This one is obviously the front plate, and I've made holes everywhere I need to. So toggle switch between CV and local control for pitch is going to be there. The 12 buttons that I'm actually keeping, which are the 8 voices and the 4 system controls, I've made holes for, and I'm going to be using the old buttons there. I've actually attached these to that rubber dome plate, and with a bit of basswood as a standoff, just because it's what I had on hand. Right here will be the volume knob. This is where the output jack will go, which I've got a new jack there. Now have an actual mono 1/4-inch TS jack. And power switch will go here with emergency reset there. This is a veneer on plywood. This plywood is pre-veneered, which makes it such that when you put a hole in it, you rip the veneer off, no matter how much tape you put on to try and keep it in place. So the back side of this looks ugly, but the front side just has a fresh veneer over it. I've got another piece of that same plywood for the back here, so that'll go back there. And then the front, since those keys, here's the keys, they have these little teeth on the front, and those need to stick into something. So this is not actually a piece of plywood. This is some basswood that I have laid out, and there's a piece of flat basswood on the front, and that'll go on the front like that, and the keys will go in it. So next thing I need to do is cut side pieces and then glue this all together. All the tiny clamps. Some cross bracing in there. I've painted the inside here. Not that you can really tell yet, but I've painted all the parts that are going to show. I painted them wood color. Bought new switches. Got some washers to go over the old holes so that it doesn't look absolutely ridiculous with those switches in those holes.
After that, I mounted all the hardware, although I'm afraid I didn't film that part. With everything mounted, here's how the front of the case looked, and here's the inside. A few adjustments still needed to be made though, and now 2 years later I've finally gotten around to doing that. This entire case is made of plywood, and the veneer over it is peeling everywhere. I need to fix that. The second issue, these buttons don't work. Well, some of them work, but about half of them work at a time, and it's temperamental about which ones work and which ones don't. Incidentally, while I'm pulling this apart, the other thing, the only electronic change I've made to this is adding this Vactrol, and this switch to flip between the internal clock resistor that I've added, or the external CV input that I've added. This Vactrol doesn't work at all, so I'm going to remove it. My plan is to eventually put a Synthrotek vac pack in there, and then run that jack to it, and then run it to these terminals. But for now, as long as I'm taking this apart, I'm just going to pull that Vactrol out and leave that disconnected. Alright, so I've gotten everything out. The next thing is to remove these bits of basswood that are currently acting as standoffs, and I'm going to fit this in there. Well, actually, what I'm going to do first is I'm going to trim this down. I'm going to trace out some geometry on here as to what size it should actually be. I'm going to trim it down close, and then mark out where it is on here so that I can cut. So I finished putting in the new panel there. Everything is reassembled and complete for now. Let me talk about a couple of the things that I changed. You'll notice I removed this LED strip. That's because I removed anything that used it when I took out the ROM pack, so there was no point in keeping it, and it's just easier to mount screws around that when it's not there. Also, there's this piece of foil tape that I added. That's to shield all of this clock control stuff. I used to get issues with interference. As I get my hand closer, it would affect the clock speed of the board, and it would kind of waver in pitch. And while that's a neat effect, it's not really what I'm going for on this board. Incidentally, I still have a couple of things left to do. Obviously, when I put this piece in, I peeled up a bit of the paint, so I gotta fix that. Also, this still has no bottom. I plan on doing that eventually. I'll add a piece of trim around the edge here to hold in a piece of acrylic so that you can still see inside. Everything seems to have lined up slightly differently than it did before, and I'm not sure how that happened. The keyboard went about this way, billionth of a millimeter, and now these keys scrape. That's because of this piece of basswood that I've got here. Those supports are just too far that way. So I gotta take them out and glue them in a little bit to the right. There's also some electronic modifications that I plan to put in. I've got all sorts of things left to do on this board, but for now it's assembled and working. And that is how I will leave it for at least a little while.